Welcome to JCT Friends. Jim Cantelon here. Great show today. You're going to be hearing from Todd Cantelon in our head-to-head segment. He has been working significant hours in Israel, putting together an amazing documentary called The Book, and you'll hear more about that in the future. But he also grew up in Israel, and we're going to get some reflections from Todd on Israel today. And also Greg Musselman with part 2 of our interview, Voice of the Martyrs, on the situation in Syria. A loaded half hour. Stick with us. Back with Head to Head and Todd Cantelon. We've talked a couple of times, Todd, about this marvelous project you're involved in, this documentary project called The Book. And you've been to Israel shooting it more than once. It's been a major project to this point in time, and it has seen you returning to the place where you grew up.
Yeah, pretty cool.
And I'd just like to, take a few minutes and talk about your impressions of Israel, as an adult, remembering, going there when you were 7 years of age and learning the Hebrew language and becoming enculturated. And is it like going home to you?
Well, I feel very comfortable there. My home is where my wife and kids are.
Right.
So that's where home is. Yeah. So, regardless of where they are, that's home. So no, they're not there with me, so it doesn't. But that said, I do feel it's very familiar. I went back for the first time several years ago on a different production, and what was interesting to me was to see how small it felt through an adult's eyes. Because, as a kid, we had the run of the town, speaking of Jerusalem, and so I remember it as bigger than it is. Now as an adult, you realize, wow, this whole city is, traffic notwithstanding, nothing is further than 10 minutes away. Yeah. You can literally walk the whole city as you used to do.
Oh, yeah.
And as we did with, or biked or skateboarded or whatever. So how small it is. Much more religious than when I was a boy. Jerusalem has become more and more a place for religious Jews. So that's interesting and different.
Now, this is something I think the average viewer would like to have a bit more input on, because generally speaking, unless you've lived there, in any culture, of course, this is the case, but you don't really understand the layers of complexity. Like when we talk about someone as being Jewish, we say, well, they're Jewish. Just like when they talk of someone being Christian, they're Christian, as if there is one sort of a one-size-fits-all. But there's any number of layers of Judaism, for instance, in Jerusalem, for example.
Yeah, well, you would be a Jew just by birth. It's like a race. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, it applies to race and religion. But there are many. Now, what we used to call a secular Jew would refer to themselves as an Israeli, really. And so, in Jerusalem itself, you used to have, when we lived there, there were Westerners, there were secular Jews, Israelis, there were, 3, 4, 5 different types of religious Jew, going from, very, as you would say, a little more relaxed, a little left of center, reformed, right up through Haredim, right up through ultra-Orthodox. But, there are whole neighborhoods that I remember playing in. We drove through one of them just on our way down from French Hill, and those used to be neighborhoods full of Israelis, secular Jews, non-practicing people. And literally, it's all religious now. And I asked, because it was such a stark contrast from what I remembered, I would often ask, different Israelis I meet, like, how come it's all religious Jews? And they said, listen, one of our drivers actually said to me, all your friends have left Jerusalem. They've all moved to Tel Aviv and Ra'anana. They've all moved to the coast, the Mediterranean coast, which is kind of the secular, has become, it always was, but much more so now, has become the secular enclave of the country. And leaving Jerusalem, and it's even happening even in Tiberias. When I was there, they were talking about you're getting an influx of religious Jews to these cities. And I'm not saying there's a plan, but it can feel like there's a plan to populate the city intentionally with people who believe a certain way and practice their belief in a certain way as well.
And then the Haredim or the Hasidim, the ultra-Orthodox, do have a certain worldview, do they not? In most cases, they do not pay taxes. They do not do military service. And they have very much a view of Israel that would be much more consistent with the idealistic Zionism of the past than currently, right?
Yeah, and there are, I mean, there are some who don't recognize the existence of the state. They're the gold cloaks,
Right.
you know. So if you ever see, you know, a religious Jew and he's in a golden cloak, they're the kind that they don't even recognize the existence of the state. This is a big issue. I mean, most people we work with are secular Jews, so just Israelis. And if you ask them about this, I mean, there is deep bitterness about the fact that, you know, they would say that the ultra-Orthodox are basically freeloading. They get paid a huge stipend, billions of dollars a year, is paid from the government to the ultra-Orthodox who don't work. They study full-time. Many times the people I spoke to talked about them while they have businesses on the side that are off the books. And so, you know, be that as it may, I'm not an authority on this. I'm just, you know, talking about what people said to me. But, you know, there's definitely a deep sense of bitterness on the part of many of the secular Israelis that I spoke with, in terms of them feeling like the state is, you know, has been upheld for a long time it was founded by secular Jews. For the most part, it has been upheld. The tax base, for sure, is, you know, on the backs of secular Jews. And you have this increasing population of religious Jews who don't necessarily, or are seen to not necessarily contribute to the state in the same way as their secular counterparts do. And I can understand, if you're a secular Jew, how that would make you feel bitter. And one of the most troubling things for me, I mean, I mentioned to several people on my return from this last trip that I didn't speak to a single, this sounds like hyperbole, but no lie, I didn't speak to a single secular Israeli who didn't say, within a matter of moments and unsolicited, that all they want to do is leave. I just want to get out of here. I want to leave. There's no future for me here. I want to get my family out of Israel as soon as I can. And this is a big, you know, this is a big about face in 68 years for that to be, and I'm just saying it was unsolicited, just every secular Jew I talked to, that was part of the conversation.
I suppose that there's a lot of peace talk fatigue that has entered in on both sides.
Every single secular Jew I talked to said, just give them the territories, meaning the Palestinians, just give it to them. And it's interesting, you know, when we grew up there was no Palestinian territory. There was no fence that was put up during the Second Intifada because it got so bad. But I, again, in my conversation said, you know, as an outsider, and a kid who grew up here, I call myself Chetzi Israeli, half Israeli. To me, it seems like a retreading of the Yishuv. If you look at the lines pre-1948, you know, you basically had secular Israel along the coast, and then you had this big enclave here, and then it divided over Jerusalem. It's I mean, it's not exactly the same, but in many ways, very similar. The other thing that I noticed is really different, you know, when I was a kid, the Arabs didn't really come into Jerusalem. They stayed in their villages, which are now cities, and they now come into Jerusalem. And so much of the discontent that was perhaps isolated to their ghettos, if you want to use that term, is now right in your face. And so there's no escaping the clear and present danger that lurks in their eyes.
Now, when you talk about the Arab villages becoming cities, are we talking this as a result of birth rate?
Yeah, just population growth.
Population growth.
Yeah. I mean, so I mean, where we used to live in French Hill, Issaouia was a little tiny village. Now it's a city. It's a city. You know, one day we had to drive through Abu Tor, not even Abu Tor. What's the one? Is it Abu Tor? Yeah, we had to drive through Abu Tor or Wadi Joz. And I mean, I never went there as a kid. You just don't go to these places. And now as an adult to go, and I mean, it is the third world. It is the third world. And as much as I was raised in an Israeli system and am therefore indoctrinated as an Israeli and therefore have a anti-Arab bias, for sure. You know, that's just how I was raised, and that's just a part of who I am, and also part of my anecdotal experience in terms of getting in fights with Arab kids almost every week because of how I looked and them assuming I was an American, and yada, yada, yada. We just never went to these places, didn't ride our bikes or stayed away. So to go in as an adult and to see these guys just lounging around, loitering around, you realize if they have a sense that they have no future, which is what it looks like to me as an outsider, I can imagine as a young Arab male being very unhappy about that. And I can understand doing whatever it takes to try to find a way to change my circumstances. And then you couple that with, say, you know, during our time in the city of David, which used to be called Silwan and is really a flashpoint when it comes to Arab-Israeli tension. You know, our gracious hosts at the city of David are driving us up to our enclave and just talking to us about the tensions they deal with on a daily basis. And you see a religious family that has moved into the city of David, an Israeli family, with their bodyguards. They have full-time armed guards to walk them to and from their house. And you sit there as a Westerner going, man, you got to be seriously committed to a cause, greater than, that to which most of us have devoted our lives, in order to pay the price that is exacted for you to build a life in Jerusalem and/or contested Jerusalem.
I'm sitting here listening to you talking about this in very intelligent and educated terms. Also, as a veteran, if you will, Israeli. And I remember when you were a little boy, when in the early months after we just moved to Jerusalem, the only one who could really speak any Hebrew was you. We put you into grade 2 in December, and within months you were speaking fluent Hebrew, thanks to your principal. He used to give you an hour a day tutoring, right? Plus you had friends who spoke Hebrew. But I remember many times we'd have to talk to the telephone company, we'd have to talk to the bank, and we'd get you as a little 7-year-old to come and do the talking for us. You remember that?
Yeah, and we did it on this trip as well.
But the memory that really sticks with me, and it happens so often on Shabbat, or just this Erev Shabbat, just as Sabbath was about to begin, there'd be this little knock at the door. And I always knew what it was. I'd open the door, and there would be a little Orthodox man with his long black coat and his black hat and his curly locks, mumbling at me in Hebrew because his automatic lighting system had failed to work, and he wanted you or Jess to go over and turn the lights on for him. Yeah. Remember, we were you were the neighborhood heathen. Yeah. You were the goy. You were the Shabbos goy.
You laugh about it, but it's a picture into the stark divide that is still very much the reality. We went to, again, one of our hosts invited us to his house for Erev Shabbat, and Sator and I went, and of course we showed up with kippahs, and he wasn't home yet. He was at synagogue, and so his wife was there and his sweet little kids, and they are transplants from New Jersey. And while the mother did the Erev Shabbat intonation over the candles, his little 3-year-old boy was watching us very closely and noticed that we weren't davening, and said at the end, "Why you didn't daven?" And I didn't tell him, because I didn't want to explain to him that I come from a different side of the tracks, and had a neat conversation with his dad about that afterwards, just in terms of how do you explain to a 3-year-old boy that this man believes something totally different from us, yet in his humanity is the same as us, and that, in a microcosm, is the story of Israel.
Boy, isn't it true? So fascinating, Todd. Thanks for those insights and those reflections. I'll be back with some Bible teaching right after this.
Everyone has a story. We'd love to hear about yours. Write to us and tell us about it. JimCantelonToday.com.
I left you hanging last time, didn't I? Talking about this sword that Peter had in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let me unhang you, if possible. Unhinge you. There's no explanation, why Peter had this sword right there in John. You got to search the other Gospels to come up with any clue. And in Luke chapter 22, you've got Luke's account of the conversation in the upper room, and then Jesus' instructions to the disciples about getting ready, the supplies they would need for what lay ahead. He knew full well that his disciples were going to suffer adversity, and in most cases martyrdom in their ministries, with the exception of John, who wrote the Gospel of John and the letters to John, and also the book of Revelation in his elder years. Revelation, in this case, from the penal colony on the island of Patmos. Thomas, who took the gospel to southern India, and we don't know how he died, perhaps a natural death, but he left a very vital church there. There are Indians to this day in southern India called Thomasites. But nevertheless, he's telling them what to, in Luke 22, to take with them. If you have a purse, he says, take it. Likewise, a bag. Let him who has no sword sell his mantle and buy one. This is Jesus talking. That's something you don't hear about very much. For I tell you that the scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was reckoned with transgressors, for what is written about me has its fulfillment. Now, most commentators, they shake their heads at this. They say, no. I refuse to believe that Jesus was telling his disciples to buy a sword. I remember reading that in one commentary. And then some spiritualize it, and they refer to sword as in the sense of Ephesians 6, where the Apostle Paul tells the Ephesian Christians to take up the sword of the Spirit. But others say, no, no. Jesus was anticipating that the disciples were going to face a huge adversity, probably physical violence, and they needed something to protect themselves. We don't know. Then later in Luke 22, when he's talking about this sword business, let me just turn there, because I find this absolutely fascinating. I don't have it on the screen for you, but let me find it here. The disciples say, "Look, Lord, we already have 2 swords." And he says, "That's enough," and he moves on. Now, Bible commentators again say, enough in terms of that's all you need, or enough more of a dismissal. That's enough. Let's not talk about this anymore. I don't know. But regardless, Peter has a sword. And he tried to cut off the slave's head with it and missed because the guy ducked and just got his ear. Now, in the Luke edition, Jesus picks up the ear, puts it back in place, and heals the guy. John doesn't mention that, but Luke does. All right. Verse 12. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. Now you say, Jewish officials, what's up with that? There were sort of 2 systems of law. And the Romans, who oversaw all criminal law, allowed the religious leaders of Jerusalem to have their own sort of civil/religious law to cover, some of the minor and some of the petty and some of the strictly religious disputes and dimensions of justice that they faced from day to day. And, the Roman authorities found the Jewish wrangling over various points of Mosaic law to be more than obnoxious. So they just basically, oh, you guys handle that, okay? You handle that. Well, to lend some kind of authority to that, they actually had temple soldiers who had limited power under the authority of the Roman occupation. And that's who we've got here, Jewish officials coming to arrest Jesus. Bound him. Why they had to bind him? I guess, when you get arrested today, the first thing they do is put you in handcuffs. So I suppose that's de rigueur. Brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. So they're bringing him to the ultimate religious official at this point, who's Annas, who's the older of the 2, father-in-law of Caiaphas. And Caiaphas, John says, was the one who'd advised the Jewish leaders it'd be good if one man died for the people. This is when they were, saying, what are we going to do with Jesus? And Caiaphas, without realizing it, gives something prophetic when he talks about one man dying for the people. Anyway, this is at nighttime, and to get up to the compound where Annas and Caiaphas would live is like walking down into the Kidron Valley and up the side of Mount Moriah and a little bit over to the south. It's sort of just out from what we now know as the Zion Gate in the city of Jerusalem. But it would take them 25 minutes maybe to walk there. While they're doing it, it's nighttime. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Now, John here is referring to himself there, another disciple. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, and why, we don't know. Why would John, John would have been maybe 17 or 18 at this point. Maybe he was a friend of the high priest's kid. We don't know. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. Verse 16, but Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, referring to himself, John, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there. She was the doorkeeper, the gal in charge of opening and closing the door, and brought Peter in. Okay, so on the basis of John's being known by this gal, Peter comes into the courtyard of this compound. She looks at Peter. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? He replied, I am not. I am not. What's going on here? Peter has just sliced the ear off Malchus. According to Luke, Jesus has picked the ear up and put it back in place and healed the guy. You'd think he'd be overwhelmed again with the power of the Savior, but instead it's, I'm going to save my own skin. Self-preservation has a huge role to play in our lives, and you know this is true when the policeman pulls you over for a speeding ticket. Your immediate response is, I didn't do it, I wasn't speeding, I'm innocent. You want to protect yourself, even if it means lying. And that's what Peter does. Astonishing, Jesus had predicted it, but this is just number one of 2 more denials to come.
Very few African mothers ever see a doctor or midwife, yet each mother knows how fragile her child's life is. You see, 26,000 children under the age of 5 will die today because they don't have access to medical care. Your gift of $260, just $22 every month, helps stock a mobile clinic and train healthcare workers to care for young mothers and their children during pregnancy and preschool years. Join WOW Mother Care now. Protect the life of a mother and her child.
Back with Greg Musselman from Voice of the Martyrs. Greg, we talked about Syria last time. We have to pick it up because there's so much more to talk about. In your Voice of the Martyrs magazine, you have an article that talks about the reaction to ISIS on the part of many Muslims. They're horrified by the beheadings and all of the, just awful things that ISIS is doing, to the point where they're being inclined to at least consider Christianity. Is ISIS, in a strange way, playing a role in the evangelization of that part of the world?
I really think they are. In fact, I have a video, war opens hearts to the gospel in Syria. And again, with a long, Christian history, it used to be a Christian country, and of course Islam and the whole part of that world there in the Middle East. But yeah, what's happening is that people are saying, no, that's not Islam. ISIS is not Islam. And then, and it's interesting because every time there's an attack, you'll have the President of the United States or you'll have the Prime Minister of Britain or even our Prime Minister in Canada immediately saying, no, Islam is a religion of peace. And so what it's doing is, and we could debate that, and I've talked to Muslims about this as well, but they're starting to look and say, okay, well, is that what the Quran teaches? Is that the traditional teachings of Muhammad and the Hadith? Is that Islam? What ISIS is doing? Because that's what they're claiming. They're saying, it's like Osama bin Laden. What motivated him, to go after America and the trade towers in New York City? Because they feel that Islam was getting watered down. So what it's doing is it's causing many Muslims to start to look into the Quran. And many of the Muslims that I talk to, in Jordan and also in Lebanon, is that when I talk, they didn't know anything about Islam. They were Muslim by culture. And I've heard, leaders like the Ravi Zacharias is saying, there's not 1.5 billion Muslims. If you're really talking about people following Islam, it's like, are there 2 billion Christians? Maybe by name, but how many are following Jesus? And so what's happening is they're coming to places like Jordan and to Lebanon. They're meeting Christians, and as they're meeting them, they're seeing the kindness, and they are at least open to the gospel. And then you've got that other piece, which is a huge piece, is the dreams and visions.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about this. Tell me about it.
I think it's become a phenomenon. We used to hear the stories before, the odd one, and oh, that's awesome, and you'd, see it on a Christian television program, and you go, well, that's amazing. Every time I travel, especially in the Muslim world, and that's not saying it doesn't happen to North Koreans and other places, and Hindus and Buddhists or whatever, or nominal Christians, but it seems to be especially amongst the Muslim world. Where the Lord is intervening and giving dreams and visions of Jesus in various ways. And there's also some death experiences, and and I've met some people like that on the field as well, where they've died and they've had this encounter in heaven. And you go, okay, well, that's, pretty phenomenal. And so now to me, it's not that it'll ever become just sort of routine, but it's become common. And these are also people that, they, like Layla we met, in Lebanon. She grew up in a Muslim home. She was fully garbed, married at 18. Husband abused her, beat her. Eventually they left Syria, Aleppo, came to Beirut, and just through kindness of Christians, they were giving her food. She started to read the Bible, and she talked about reading in Matthew chapter 5, the salt and the light. And as she was reading, it's like the words disappeared. Jesus appeared to her. her life changed, she changed, the husband became very violent towards her, and eventually the Sharia court actually granted her a divorce. But those are some of the stories, and she said, I knew nothing about Islam.
Is there a common theme in these dreams and visions?
Like,
what's the commonality? Would there be one thing?
I would say it'd be Jesus appearing to them.
Jesus appearing, looking like what?
Well, some cases it was just the bright light. Some they could see a vision.
What, in a voice?
Well, in Layla's case, she said, the voice spoke to her, and she didn't know what it was. By the way, sometimes the Muslims will think this is a demonic thing, but they'll go and they'll talk to the Christians, and it said, you are my daughter, and I love you. And you think about what this Layla had gone through, the beatings and the abuse. So she went to the Christians, they explained it, and she came to Christ.
And they know who it is.
Well, they don't know at that moment sometimes. Sometimes they'll say, I knew it was Jesus, or, Isa.
The Quran talks about Isa a lot.
Absolutely. And the thing about people maybe not aware of, that Muslims, especially during Ramadan, that's why we really need to be praying, is they are praying for, visions, Allah. So when Jesus appears on the scene, it's like, whoa, this is not right.
Doesn't quite fit with the expectation, but there he is. This is absolutely fascinating. We can talk more about. Our time is gone. Greg Musselman from Voice of the Martyrs. And you'll be hearing from him again, so don't despair. I'll be back with more right after this.
This is a Voice of the Martyrs Canada news update, a special report.
More than 200,000 Syrians have lost their lives in 4+ years of armed conflict. About a quarter of them were Christians. Prior to the uprising and then the war, there were about 3 million Christians in the country. About half of them have left, and most of the rest want to leave as well.
It breaks my heart to see what is happening to my nation with all the terrorism and the violence among the people.
If you would have come to Syria before, you would have seen how it was full of churches and beautiful Christian places, and now it's all gone. It's all destroyed.
Amani was encouraged by the concern and support of the Voice of the Martyrs Canada, but is pleading with Christians everywhere to continue to pray.
For more information, visit www.vomcanada.com.
I don't know if it occurred to you, friends, but Israel and Syria are neighbors. And when Todd was growing up there and Kathy and I were living there with Todd's brother and sister in Jerusalem, we were very aware of the tensions in the Golan Heights with Syria. Right now, those tensions are kind of been eclipsed by the civil war in Syria, but it's really refreshing and educational. Hear from people like Todd and Greg Musselman. Hope you've been encouraged. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Contact us. Jim Cantelon today. P.O. Box 989, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 3Y7. If you're sending a check, make it payable to Jim Cantelon today. Or visit us online at jimcantelontoday.com and click Support.